We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable.
The vast stretches of the unknown, the unanswered, and the unfinished.
Resistance and change often begin in the art of words.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The voices who can see alternatives to how we live now. The realists of a larger reality.
Welcome to the Cosmic Co-op. Welcome back, friends. This is episode 4. I'm Sam, your host, aka the Financial Witch. And today's episode is going to cut straight to the marrow, I think, because we're embracing the new moon in Capricorn that's happening today. It's also my birthday as I'm recording this, so the renewal vibes are very strong right now. I am feeling incredibly blessed to have this podcast, to have this vehicle for connection, to have you, the listener. It's truly a gift in and of itself to even be able to create something like this. And it ties in really beautifully, actually, with this week's episode, with the conversation I'm having with Siobhan with Soft Power. We're going to talk about a lot of things like creative power, obviously anti-capitalism. We're going to talk about how embracing change, even when it feels messy or uncertain, is actually an act of profound resistance. And I'm also going to read a listener submission that asks one of those questions that really makes you think. It's about moving between safety and risk, between stability and evolution, and just pokes at some questions that I feel are really deeply tied to everything that we're talking about today. Before we get started, I want to give you a heads up. This episode does include discussions of abortion and interpersonal abuse. So please take care of yourself as you listen. Pause if you need to. This isn't about pushing through for the sake of discomfort. It's about holding space for all of the complicated realities of life under capitalism. And we all have to find ways to move forward with intention. So take care of yourself. Now, this listener question floored me in the best way possible. They wrote, I am torn between two goals, it seems. On one hand, I want to move somewhere that is a bit more queer-friendly with great public transportation so that at least mine and my family's quality of life can be improved. However, I feel that this move could draw me away from nature and from my craft, which is herbalism-based in many ways. I don't know how I could relate to nature in a bigger city, but on the other hand, I am so weary of living where I grew up in a suburban hellscape that is only traversable by car. When I speak to my family about wanting to move to Chicago, they feel it comes out of nowhere and doesn't fit my personality. But I'm starting to wonder if I have just been self-isolating my true desires out of a need to feel stable or secure in my relationships, and maybe being a bit afraid of such a huge change. Anyway, I wonder how one prepares financially and spiritually for such a big change when they are still feeling unsure of its wisdom and alignment. And that question is an entire episode all on its own, but I'm weaving it into this conversation because it's one that Siobhan and I talked about before we recorded, and I just didn't get a chance to bring it up in our conversation. It feels really foundational to the conversation that Siobhan and I have that you're about to listen to about navigating huge life-altering shifts while remaining tethered to your values and your desires, even when that path forward is not the prescribed path and thus can feel really murky and really risky. So my hope is that you'll find your way through this dialogue, whether you're on the cusp of a big move or maybe you are just reevaluating your craft or you're just trying to figure out how to live a more aligned life in a system that thrives on disconnection and doubt. Siobhan and I talked about how creative power is both a balm and a battering ram, really, against capitalism, and how it can carve out space for authenticity, even in places that might feel inhospitable to your spirit. We're going to be unpacking that along with some of the ways that creative power can help us all be students of change, of chaos even. This is a thing that came up while Siobhan and I were talking, that she mentioned about being a student of change and understanding that change is not only inevitable, but change in itself is a birthing process. It is part of the birth-death cycle, and it's something that we can't escape. So being a student of change is, in and of itself, being a student of birth. But I'll let Siobhan tell you all about how she arrived at that conclusion and how being a student of change can liberate you from things like rigid expectations, whether those are coming from internally, from your family, from society, from capitalism, all of that kind of stuff. And this also ties into the new moon in Capricorn, which we're experiencing today. So let's get into that. So the new moon in Capricorn is happening right now at 9 degrees. And this is our final lunation of 2024. I think this is a really significant period that we're putting on the year here with this lunation. And on a personal note, since it's also my birthday, that means that this new moon is not only conjunct my solar degree, but it's baked into the solar return chart for my entire year going forward. So it holds a lot of personal significance for me. And I'm also thinking about the significance that it holds to bookend the year with a new moon in Capricorn. I think it really reflects a lot of things that are going to be said in this conversation, especially in terms of examining the boundaries that you place on yourself and where they come from, and even sometimes changing your relationship to things that might feel restrictive or like roadblocks to the life that you really want to live. Sometimes when we get to examine those things really deeply, when we get to be introspective in the way that new moons encourage us to be, sometimes you can come full circle and realize that something that seems unpleasant or forced upon you can be something that you choose. So even on the outside, nothing has changed internally. The way that you feel about the boundaries or restrictions in your life can still reflect a more liberated internal landscape. And Siobhan makes a really good point about this in our conversation as well. Taking responsibility does not mean blaming yourself for the circumstances you're in. Taking responsibility for your circumstances simply means noticing where you have a choice and noticing where you are living out the consequences of your choices, and just noticing, not placing any judgment on it, not trying to say what's good or bad about it, momentarily removing your own judgment and observing where you are responsible and if and where you have been stepping up to that responsibility. Examining the things in your life that maybe feel like you don't have a choice about them, and maybe you truly don't, but dig a little deeper and figure out where within this restriction am I still allowed to make decisions? Where within this do I have some agency and some autonomy? This is really important, especially when you're talking about things like anti-capitalism. You're going to face restrictions in an oppressive system. Guess what? You're going to be oppressed unless you're part of the ruling class, which if you're listening to this podcast, you're most likely not. And that's Saturn. That's Capricorn. That's the limiting structures of the world that you live in. But this new moon in Capricorn is the lunation every year that always pulls me the most towards, and taking an internal review, an inventory of my responsibilities and where I've been avoiding them, or maybe perhaps where I haven't even noticed that things are my responsibility. I will always say on this podcast, and I will continue to say, that dismantling capitalism is not an individual job. That also doesn't mean that your individual decisions don't matter. But the heart of what I mean when I say that is, don't put everything on yourself to solve everything. And at the same time, don't shirk away all responsibility just because you recognize that it's impossible for you to solve everything. Just because you can't solve everything doesn't mean you give up and work towards nothing. So happy new moon in Capricorn. happy birthday to me. And let's get into this conversation. I don't remember when I started following you online or when I found you on the internet, but you were still at the end of your birth doula practice. You just recently ended that, right?
Yeah, I officially recently closed it, and I was
Mhm.
in this like long limbo period of at least a year. The word doula is so expansive, and so I have been was swaying between this. I'm not a birth doula because I'm not like in the hospital attending births. I'm not able to attend births right now, but I'm also a doula in every single other way. But what does this mean for being a birth doula business and who's reaching out? But also, how do I like share with them that this is still relevant to you and come on with this business? I only released the title of birth doula a couple months ago.
It makes sense. It's its own process. Claiming any sort of title, I think, is its own process. And then the same thing when you let go of something like that, something that you've been doing for a while. So how does one go from like witchy birth doula mom running your own business to now starting a church with your friends? How do we get there?
Yeah. I'm seeing that it is almost an exact 3 year cycle that I'm looking at right now, like 3.5 year cycle. So I feel like the story of stories starts in early 2021. And that was coming off of giving birth to my son in 2018. After that, having it was traumatic and also status quo, and all of those typical induction, epidural, like what they call the cascade of interventions is what they call it in the birth
Yes.
work word. When you start one, then you're just cascading into them all. So that was my inception, along with talking to some other friends who had births, where I really woke up and was like, oh wow, I knew that this birthing industry was fucked, but I didn't realize exactly how fucked it was. And so that sent me off to become a doula, very politically motivated coming from there. My spiritual self I always had this concept and like general belief and connection, but I can't even really relate to what I thought before now that I'm so tapped in like with my ancestors and psychic abilities. I'm like, what was I conceptualizing? Do you relate on that? Now that it's so literal, I knew that I believed and had a relationship, but I can't really understand what I think I was connecting with.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because this is something I've been thinking only recently. And it's something I've attributed to just being out of the first Saturn return, but really noticing how much of a portal that time is. And I'm not even really a big fan of the word portal, but for me, it was motherhood and Saturn return happening at the exact same time. So it was the portal of all portals. And I'm like, I don't know who she was. I don't know her. I love
Yeah.
her, but I think it was even before I was pregnant. Somebody told me when you are pregnant, when you're giving birth, when you're just going through this process that literally billions of people have gone through, you're tapped into not only your ancestors who have done this, but just everybody in general who's ever done this. It's this huge collective portal. And yeah, going through it, same thing. I'm like, I don't know why I believed some of the things I believed. I've come to accept that some of it is like things that you're taught to believe, obviously, but especially in a capitalist sense. A lot of the things that I wanted, especially, I no longer can relate to even wanting anymore because I think they were things that capitalism told me I should want.
Totally. Yeah, those wants, I think, going all the way back to pregnancy in 2018, it was an unexpected pregnancy, but I had been with my partner at the time for quite a few years. And it locked me into that relationship escalator. Why don't we just get married? Why don't, just all these things, move back to California. He's from South Florida, so that was a very different life. And
Mhm.
that actually in itself opened up a lot of anti-capitalist things in me and a lot of softening in terms of growing up in somewhere like San Francisco, that I grew up in a very politicized family, very active labor union organizers, always volunteering for campaigns, campaigns and very neoliberal now is what I understand it to be. And being in Florida got me exposed to a little bit more of this like varying view. My first time really being around conservative people, South Floridians at that. And so coming here, giving birth, seeing how my friends were giving birth, I really see now how much I was experiencing symptoms of silencing my own voice coming out after that, because I had this sense of how I wanted to birth. I've always been not crunchy, but aware in a lot of things. And when I had mentioned the ways that I wanted to birth, immediately my mom and my sisters were like, no, this is not the time to be a hippie, Siobhan. You have a baby to worry about. Like that fear mongering around autonomy over your body.
Pretty much.
Our own fear of our body's powers. And so coming out of that, all of my postpartum experience, super under-resourced, super angry, really isolating myself because I didn't know how to name that I was just so out of alignment with myself, with my desires. 2020 hit. My kid was a little over 1 year old. I was working in healthcare. I've worked in and around workers' compensation injury for a very long time. That was a very radicalizing field for me coming out of college, working with chronic pain patients from workplace injuries, noticing the patterns of who was more injured, what demographics they come from, and how that really impacted their lives. Coming from that, where I was seeing that and still defaulting to doctors, like I had already seen so much and understood so much and just bypassed all of this wisdom that I gained observing these fucked up systems and handing over trust in that of the birth of my first child to that same exact system I already knew couldn't be trusted. And so, I was super anxious, depressed, bitter. And rather than anyone being like, hey, you seem like really different and not okay, it was like, wow, she's a very not nice person. And so I went through 2020, and the pandemic began, or the shutdowns from it began. I had started my doula business after this conversation with my then husband and my mom about birth really changed my life. This is the solution. There's still sprinkles of saviorism in there, thinking that if I just knew all of this information and if everybody else knew, then I could stop these birth outcomes and I could disrupt the status quo, because knowledge is power and information is power. And there's, of course, truth to that in some ways. But getting into birth, when I started attending births, the shutdowns happen. And so in the hospitals, I imagine you birthed after 2020.
In 2022.
Okay. The first thing they did was you can only have one person with you. And so that cut down my ability to attend births outside of single mothers. And so really my experiences then became the people who really needed the most. So people who are birthing solo parents, as well as home births. And when it comes to the word portal, it was attending home births that really, I was like, oh shit, that is a portal. My very first home birth was for my friend Bianca, who now is a doula as well. And I'll always be so grateful and so amazed. I actually should look up the chart for this first birth one day, because she invited me, and herself, her midwife, and her whole birth team were all Black women, all Afro-Indigenous, trained in an Afro-Indigenous framework for birth work. And so to experience that as my first home birth and see uninterrupted physiological birth and to be part of that, and on top of that, the baby's name was Legacy. It just really, like, to say the least, it changed my life spiritually. So that was like in July 2020. Now, when I really think about that, that was happening in tandem with my marriage falling apart, because my doula training, shout out Cornerstone Doula Trainings, was so holistic in the political weaving, all of these other pieces, especially in what it takes to be a doula and show up, and that self-care and that personal commitment. In order to do my job, I was now looking at the life around me and was like, oh, this is really not in alignment with what I'm working towards and everything that I believe in. And so when I say 2021 kicked things off, I think that was like integrating 2020. I took that leap to leave my day job because for the first year and a half, I was attending births with my PTO while working in healthcare full time still, with a 1-year-old. I don't know where I had this energy. This was like full adrenaline. That's why I burned out this year, because it was full adrenaline. She was showing up. She was doing shit. I was on Clubhouse holding 7 a.m. every Monday morning manifesting calls, which again, I'm like, what did I think manifesting was even at that time? I'm not quite sure.
And why do we have to do it at 7 o'clock on Monday morning?
Because that was a time I had and it was hilarious. And I could never now like immediately know, but this is related to all of this because you really find those little things. And that's what I believe now to be manifesting is finding those little places you can experience or access that feeling, and then letting it grow and amplify and expand into the rest of my life. So that really was how that started, was like, I'm going to do these things at 7 a.m. on a Monday and with my PTO. And this is a life that I want. And it was a little aggressive because I aggressively needed to get out of that life. But I gave my notice at this healthcare job, and like the first or second week that I was fully self-employed, I found out I was pregnant. And my spouse is working in grocery, and at the start of that year too was like, dude, I really see you struggling from this and we need to find a solution because we are splitting apart here. He did not talk to me for 2 weeks because he just didn't know what to do. And so I chose to have an abortion, and that all was transpiring along. It's follow my marriage, starting this full-time business, choosing abortion. Now I know that majority of abortions are people with children already, but I didn't quite know that at the time. And I had imagined for myself, of course, I'm in full support of abortion, but I don't have an excuse. I'm already married with a kid. I can do that. And that was the spiritual initiation for me because it was the first time that I really acknowledged you don't have to do the things you're able to do. You get to actually have choices. You get to choose what kind of life you want moving forward. And that's so obvious, but it was so radical for me at the time. And so I did that. And at the same time, I'm on Instagram sharing about my work. And now I can see in hindsight that the people that I met in that same exact time were the people that were sent to navigate this because they are also in their own way reclaiming their voice, reclaiming their body, their autonomy, their soft power, if you will. And so how I really got through all of that and kept showing up for my job was by going to these Zoom gatherings where we were just meditating and co-regulating, co-working sometimes, and just mirroring through this. And they were other people that had left academia or left the medical field or other traditional professions, and were like, okay, this is something I really want to do, but my nervous system is shot. And so how do we keep showing up? Let's just like keep getting on Zoom so nobody vanishes. And so that was how the church started. It wasn't until just like this year that we were like, oh, this qualifies as a church. But when I look back, I'm like, okay, yeah, we were linking up to meditate and connect with spirit just very intuitively. And one of those people is also Filipino and Irish, and she's an adoptee, and my dad's an adoptee. And we had all of these parallels that we were like, whoa, this is getting freaky.
My dad's also an adoptee.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of these, I now call it Dr. Kiki, my friend and co-founder, calls it the Ancestral Algorithm, but I now can really see the ways that when I postured that to the universe, that I'm ready for my best and most aligned life, my husband started falling away. Certain friends and people started falling away. New people were coming into my life. And I was even like, I'm ignoring all my friends and just like on Zoom with these strangers I met on the internet. But I know sometimes those internet friends are the life-saving friends.
For real.
Like another thing I've grown to see is, yeah, for queer people, for moms, this is the only place where we can find sometimes folks that are aligned. And what can that create now if we keep showing up for that? And again, not dismiss that as just an internet friendship, because it's real. Now we've gone on vacation together, met each other's families, we're part of each other's families. They're aunties to my kid. And that past self would be like, that's wild. That random chick on Instagram. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Because spirit moves through all these interesting ways.
I love
But in
that.
turn, yeah. I think opening up that spiritual impact of how I was orienting to the world, studying physiological birth and seeing the ways that my life was mirroring the cycles of birth. It all just expanded my thinking from childbirth to the birthing cycle in general, death, all of that. And over time have learned that is what these cosmologies that are part of my ancestral legacy and lineage believed in, especially Taoism would say that birthing is not exclusive to childbirth. It is a process, and sometimes that's a child. And so that's why I say that shift from birthing into spiritual consulting and now a church it felt more separate, but it was very much like the same things happening, mirroring one another. And even now, I still get caught in the in between of I'm speaking about this in this way. Oh, they still think I'm talking about a literal baby. Hold on. Am I available for literal babies right now? And over time, I'm like, okay, actually, no, I'm not. So 2021, meeting these people, my marriage falling apart, me choosing to eventually separate from my spouse, that impacting my birth business. During that, I was still attending births. I was still supporting people with abortion or loss and post both virtually and locally. And then the help that I was promised with the help that I was actually receiving. When I caught myself, I was like, you're clinging more to now it's your ego clinging on to everything that you built or holding on to this saviorism really as a birth doula and what that meant back to something more vulnerable, which was stepping out as a witch. It went from doing this really honorable, community accepted and celebrated thing. People hear you're a birth doula and they're like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. It really strokes your ego. And people are like, that's one of my favorite things to hear someone does. I'm like, yeah, and I do that. I was like, dang, I just started fitting in. Now I got to go back to being a radical weirdo.
Yeah.
But then I found my other radical weirdos.
Right.
And yeah, so 2021, being up against this, like, how do I attend and serve these people while also observing who was able to pay my full fees? What did I have to silence in myself to show up for them? How do I show up for the people who really need my services without being a martyr myself? And that's like a huge issue in the doula world because doulas are badass. There's really very few employment opportunities for doulas. So most people are there because they were radicalized in some way and were like, I'm going to show up to do this. Or their moms that are like, this is one way I can have a business and show up. But it's not really a very fruitful field. And especially on the internet, you could see these doulas with big followings, but it's not because they're attending births usually. It's because they have some other skills they've created. Usually they're coaching other doulas.
Yeah.
Or things that I'm like, the realest badass busiest doulas do not have time for the internet. So now I even see doulas with big platforms. I'm always raising an eyebrow like, all right, what else are you up to? Because this isn't the kind of work you need a big platform for. The people are in your neighborhood.
It's also a job that maybe requires you to get up and leave in the middle of the night when you also have your own children. It's not conducive to a mom's schedule, unfortunately.
Totally. You have to
Yeah.
have a community for it. And when I have mentor doulas, that's the first thing that I tell people to get very real about is what does it actually take for you to be able to show up for this type of offering you want to give, this type of service you want to provide? Because you may feel called to be a doula, and that means for the next 2 years, you need to be building the type of relationships that can support that type of lifestyle because it's a lifestyle. It's a beautiful lifestyle. There's so many great things about it because that is what healed my relationship to rest, especially in that abortion period. When I had the abortion, I was on call for births and it really pushed me to sit with my capacity, sit with my self-care. And that is what I'll always be grateful for my time as a birth doula and a postpartum doula, was like knowing I cannot allow myself to be depleted past a certain level because I have to show up and I committed to them. And that really fed me. It saved my life in a lot of ways to not let myself slip into the despair and dissociation, and knowing that, okay, I could call my friend, I could call my backup to show up for this, but also they have a lot going on. And so, how could I be really honest with myself about that boundary, that I'm not just going to call a backup because I don't feel like it, because I respect them. And I also trust that they're going to show up when I need to. I still will get calls from people like, can you do backup for this? I'm like, yes, I'm not available in any other way. But if you call me and someone needs to show up, I will find a way to show up. Right. And that really is anti-capitalism building in itself, is this doula industry, this doula culture of we show up for each other. We find creative ways to provide for the people that need us most. They may not be getting us fully on call to attend the whole birth, but I'm going to show up for you in some way. When you meet these people and you hear what they need, I'm just so Cancerian. I'm just like, feel them. And I'm like, all right, you really need somebody, and I can find that person for you. I could be that person in some ways, while also checking, okay, can I be that person? Who could be that? It really started to reorient my thinking into this wider web of like, all right, what are these relationships that I have? What resources do we collectively have together for this single mom who needs someone to drop off some food, walk the dog? Like, how can we get creative here? And being surprised and not surprised in other ways, because I had witnessed this before, but it is surprising to see the ways that people are willing to show up sometimes from these things. I was surprised by the people that I knew that were like, oh yeah, no question, I've got this, or I'm just going to Venmo you some money for you to support them, and seeing how much people really want to show up. But sometimes we create barriers for that because the ask is so big, or the idea of being a doula is that it has to be your entire career. And so really, this long ass answer to the question of how I went from birth work to spiritual consulting was attending, being in relationship with these people, meeting other doulas who were showing up for me, and then attending the births themselves, and eventually seeing the way that we even orient to doula work is very unsustainable, because we are all here trying to survive together with what we have. And maybe it's not a full-time job for most people. Actually, I think we just need a general cultural improvement on how we understand care and show up for each other. And that was my first kind of shift, was like, I don't think I'm actually here to be a for hire full-time business owning doula. I think I'm actually here to be part of a culture shift where we're all a little bit more aware of how we can show up for people who just gave birth, how we can talk a little differently about abortion and other stigmatized experiences, even miscarriage. And so that is what pulled me there, was that observation, as well as being at the births and seeing, oh, I'm also useless right now because you don't know how to trust your own voice. You don't have the confidence in your own decision making, and you're looking to me to speak for you, and I cannot do that. I cannot speak for you in this moment, both legally and ethically. Hospitals are becoming more hostile towards doulas and having us sign more things saying that we're not going to speak directly to providers. We're not providing advice. We're just there for comfort. We're just there. And I'm like, okay, I'm getting re-traumatized now because I've signed off on being just here for you. And I'm watching you say yes to all of these things. And I'm watching you get rolled off to a C-section. Sometimes those are life-saving. And in this case, it doesn't seem that way from what I know, and feeling, gosh, I'm not a savior after all. I'm not able to change birth outcomes with my mere presence. So really, I zoomed all the way out and was like, oh, we have to change everything.
This is so Jupiter in the ninth house of you. Everything you're saying, just like going through the realization that, yeah, as much as your one individual efforts are meaningful and can have giant ripple effects, when you zoom all the way out, staring in the face of a gigantic monster, essentially, you're like, okay, we need a spherical approach to this because, yeah, just my presence in the room is not enough. And it should be, but it's not. I think that's also a crucial part of what I've been referring to now is like when people start to come out to themselves as anti-capitalist, is that acceptance of, damn, my good intentions are so fucking good. And at the same time, alone, they are not enough. That's a tricky balance to handle. And it's tough. I think it's also part of what turns people away from exploring those feelings deeper, even just because it's the first cognitive dissonance maybe that you come up against, or one of the first instances where you hit something uncomfortable and unsalvageable at the moment. You're like, okay, this is
Mhm.
uncomfortable and I truly can't do anything about this, despite how much I want to. And it's, I don't know. For me, that type of stark acceptance comes really easily. So maybe that's why I can help other people with it. But it usually takes big experiences like that or multiple layered experiences that you suddenly realize, oh, this has been a narrative actually the entire time.
Mm.
I was even getting a little misty-eyed when you were talking about abortion because I went through the same thing earlier this year where
Mm.
I joined the club of people who already have kids and had an abortion. And just the way that you spoke about it is exactly how I felt about my experience. I never heard anybody else speak about abortion as such a nourishing thing and a portal in itself because it was through that I am married. And so it was a decision with me and my husband, but it was very much like we were immediately on the same page about we shouldn't be doing this. So it was very immediately a no for both of us, but it felt so nourishing. It took months after that. I'd say probably about 6 months after I actually had the abortion, where me and my husband arrived on deciding to not have any more kids. And at the
Mm.
time when I had that abortion, we were still just not right now. We do want more kids, but not right now, later. And so then we went through that. And then this decision coalesced together where we arrived at it individually and at the same time together of, yeah, actually, I don't think we want to do this again like ever. It was very cool to allow for that experience to be the catalyst. We were able to choose this no, something that we said no to, and it was so empowering. And like you said, it was nourishing to me to go through that and to choose that no, and then to also be a united front and to have it blossom into we realized we don't want any more children, and that's so cool to now know that, to just to have that solid knowledge of, yeah, no, we're good, we don't want to have any more kids, we're one and done. And I don't know if I would have arrived at it the same way if that hadn't happened. It was also a bit of a deeper initiation for me as a witch too, because ever since then I've just been having my own little personal inner witch revolution that I haven't talked about online. It's just been so deeply internal that I don't even have words for it. But it started
Mm.
with that abortion, with saying no. And for me, living in Oregon, it was, it was so easy. It was so easy and so simple. And that made me really emotional because I was like, God damn, it should always be like this.
Yeah.
It was so simple. It didn't cost me $1. I made the appointment. The appointment was like 5 days out. We went in, we got it done. It was so easy. It was so beautiful. They take you seriously at Planned Parenthood, or at least that's my experience. And I know I'm white, so there's medical privilege that goes into that too. But I find that generally, Planned Parenthood, they just tend to just take you a bit more seriously as a person, as a woman in general.
I did not have mine through Planned Parenthood. It was through Kaiser. I actually had an issue after with blood clotting. I experienced this, I don't know, prejudice, I guess, from a
Oh,
nurse on the phone who answered. And it was the nurse hotline that's
mm-hmm.
supposed to be there to support you. And when I said that I was experiencing this outcome from an abortion, she was like, I'm gonna have to get someone, let me get someone else to talk to you. And when the person came on, they were like, oh, they told us that you were having a pregnancy issue. And I was like, girl, yeah, so I'm
No,
glad Planned Parenthood exists for that.
right.
Kaiser, get your weird religious
That's,
or whatever the hell is happening
yeah,
right now, discrimination out of
yeah,
here.
no, that's
I'm
fucked up.
literally bleeding golf balls right now, bitch.
I don't
I
need your
don't have the
attitude,
iron supply to fight, but I'll
right?
find it.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry you went through that. It just pisses me off. Whenever I have an experience that goes the way I think it should go for everybody, I get mad because I'm like, it doesn't go like this for everybody though. And it should. Planned Parenthood, like they were up my ass for days calling me afterwards to check in on me to make sure that I was okay and to see if I needed a follow-up
Wow.
appointment. Yeah, like they called me like 3 times in the week following just to make sure I was doing all right. And again, it didn't cost me $1. None of that. Everything that you were saying about that just really resonated with me in terms of it being its own initiation into tapping into an experience that many other people have had. The image you have is like somebody who gets an abortion is like some scared young girl who's 19 and not ready. And that does happen. But when you learn that it's so much more frequently is people who are like, I have children that need me presently that already exist. And not even just like having another baby, but just being pregnant. That was my thing. I was like, I can't go through that. I had gestational diabetes. I had preeclampsia. I had all the things. Like I
Mm.
had one of those medically necessary C-sections. And like, I don't want to go through that again. I don't even want to risk it. Like, I have a kid now who has increasingly more needs as the days go by. It was interesting to join that, to feel that collective experience once again and feel very nourished in it. And
Mm.
like you said, the levels of self-care you have to access for that. Because again, if you have a kid, an abortion is not just a heavy period. You have to be sat up in bed. You have to arrange for childcare. Like the levels of care required, even that brought me into some sort of softening because I was like, wow, this is a huge act of nourishment. And it's also calling in other acts of nourishment, like in the process. I just didn't really have a way to talk about it in that sense of just being like, God, no, it was honestly like such a pleasant experience. The least pleasant part of it, the physical stuff.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all of that.
Mhm.
That's powerful. And I'm really thinking deeper into that experience. And something I forgot was that I literally had to stand in that decision because when I first became pregnant,
Mhm.
because I hadn't considered having an abortion, I told people. I remember being at a barbecue with my friends and being like, yeah, I'm pregnant again. And then being like, oh my God. I think it was partially that moment where I was standing there and they were all congratulating me. And I was like, yeah, y'all, I'm not okay. I don't think I want to be. And I'm not sure I want to
Mhm.
be. And I had a friend there who had just recently experienced a miscarriage. And I remember feeling like such a bitch that was just like, how dare I just stand here, but again had to peel back more of that stigmatization for myself. And then when I really had to share that because I had said it to my family, I grew up in a family with 3 siblings, 2 parents, everybody's around for the most part here in San Francisco. I
Yeah.
had to tell them all because I had just blurted it out. Standing in that decision felt really scary at first. And then I get calls and texts and disclosures from people who said, I've had one too, and
Mhm.
nobody knows this. And when it's your own immediate family members,
Yeah.
it really just helped me open and was like, wow, there's a reason I had to say this. There's a reason I had to experience it this way because I think there's something important, sad rising. There's something important in my journey to just be and let people witness it and let people see me like make choices and deal with the outcome and fuck up and try to pull it together. There's something in watching that journey that I've now seen has given something to them. But the other thing that I'm really thinking about as you're talking about that's really related to these other topics I know we have floating here is that it was allowing myself to just even choose anything for myself. The story itself that I can't do something holds such a power. Often I'm seeing all these other examples, another one being living at home with my family, and this feeling that I have to do this, I have no choice, this is what has to be done. It builds this disempowerment that can grow into such bitterness and resentment that even if you choose the same exact thing, just that like power of allowing yourself to have a choice is so freeing and healing and
Mhm.
radicalizing for me. It was like, oh, I'm upset right now because I'm telling myself I have no other option. But if I allow myself to believe I can do this, if I allow myself to remember that this is a choice I'm making. So, other example I'm thinking is like living with my family of origin. I can't cut them off. I can't do all of this. And eventually being like, actually, you can. You're allowed to do that. And then it brought me full circle. I don't want to do that. And I'm choosing to be here. This is my choice to be living in this situation. And because I made that choice, I'm responsible and accountable for all of the outcomes, and I'm not a victim here. What happened with my abortion was like, oh, I am accountable to this choice. I think everything following that decision was a reminder and this push to honor my own power and to honor that choice that I made. If I'm choosing to not bring this soul that I'm so connected, that I still am receiving messages and guidance and affirmation from, it was an option. It helped me understand the spiritual world a lot more. My understanding of what I believe really being like their souls that like will come to the front of the line and say, I want to do this with you, mom. And you're allowed to say no. And that's okay. And I still feel this connection, whatever it is you believe. I do believe that there's other like timelines and things where I have two sons. Like a psychic told me before I was ever pregnant the first time, told me you have these two boys close in age, Irish twin vibes. And that's exactly how that came. I have two friends who've had dreams about me with two little boys. I have one friend and they're very active in their dream world. So they were like, I had this dream that I'm like at your house. And then I look at the other little boy and they're like, you can see me? And they're like, yeah, I can. So it opened up philosophically so much for what I believe in. Recently, I had this reading where this person told me that they saw this different spirit baby. And after asking a lot of questions and like kind of discerning for myself, I was like, wow, those choices I made, those choices to turn and end a cycle and it opened new possibilities for my life. And I could never see past this age, but I actually shifted my own story or whatever, however you want to see it. And now there's someone new that might want to come with me. And their journey is going to be so different because they're not going to be born through an abusive marriage. That also healed me because when I had all this guilt about all of that from my son, this concept of the spirit baby and like negotiating with them also helped me accept, okay, there's something that like his soul I think understands that I can't, that sees like, all right, like these two people are like young and dumb, but those are my parents and there's something they're going to give me. And I see now why. For my son, it's because he's a powerful artist now. He was going through huge emotional things and now he's developing an art practice that's incredibly talented. He's very talented. I'm learning through with his therapist. He's transmuting huge emotions for huge fucked up things he's witnessed and experienced. And that's part of his journey.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
feel that
that
a lot too, like the feeling of the spirit understanding. Because even at the time when I had my
that's what
abortion,
I felt
I
through that
felt
abortion was
just,
this love, this unconditional love and
yeah.
acceptance from this spirit.
Yeah, because at the time it was even like a not now.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the time I still thought I wanted more kids. And so I was just saying, "Just not now." And even now that we've arrived on no more kids, so that spirit's never going to be here physically. It's an understanding of because I want to dedicate my limited resources to the child that I have.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to
And
birth so many other things.
yeah, it's that too. Like, well, I had to leave room for other things too. Like, as much as I love to be a mother, like, I've always known that being a mother is not like the basis of my identity, or it's not like my core path. It's just a path that I'm choosing, one of many. I need the space in my life to bring other things in right now. I also don't want to die because I have a child who needs me.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I could survive another pregnancy, that sense of deep understanding. And I've come to recognize this too, because when I work with people on the fourth house, I talk a lot about your unlived lives, like you're talking like alternate timelines, your unlived lives, or even just your former selves, former versions of yourself they become your guides. You can work with them the same way that people work with their literal ancestors. In your lifetime, you have these guides, yourself at each age who, and this is probably also because I started doing
I
therapy,
was
like
just
parts work.
thinking that
Yeah.
parts work is so compatible to this. Like
Yeah.
when I started doing it, I was like, oh yeah, this is
Yeah.
intuitively how I see my journey is like these little
Hmm.
parts are loud.
Yeah. And there's parts that I disagree with heavily. Like, my 17-year-old self is so vastly disgusted and disappointed by my life at this point, but she's got a lot of other really great qualities. So, yeah, and part of what inspired digging into that for me was people always bringing up that Sylvia Plath fucking fig tree quote to me
I don't know
about
it.
it's this she's writing about, she's imagining a fig tree spread out before her, and each one is a different life, right? This one is being a housewife and having a loving family, but this one is like being an artist traveling the world and having a string of lovers. And if you pick one, all of the other ones will rot and fall off, right? And that's just how, and that's the collapsing of timelines, is how I've come to understand it.
Mm,
You pick one fig, yeah, you close down a lot of possibilities and timelines with that, but you also at the same time open up many more. And so
mm,
the unlived lives, the versions of you that went on and did the things that you never did, the alternate timeline version of you who does have multiple children, they can still be called upon. They can still be a guide in a sense, because
mhm,
they have their own experiences, they have their own perspectives. And I think ultimately, I choose to believe that they all want the best for you, like we all want the best for each other, right? Like I want the best for alternate timeline me, so I'm going to assume that they feel the same about me, or just even
mhm.
past versions of myself too, deciding that I can be a guide to them, even reaching through time.
I think that's really helping me to see that like my active birth doula self, that little savior self who was out and
Right.
determined to improve birth outcomes for all people. I do have to listen to her because there's something in her that's so important to me, while also knowing that like my energy, my physical body cannot keep up with what she wanted to do and what she was really fired up about. But I also want to honor her and listen to her. And she keeps me in my integrity. She keeps me questioning sometimes as I do a lot more online work and a lot more creative paths of advocacy and change. Sometimes I have that like hard kind of social justice warrior in me. Is that impactful though? Are you doing enough? Is being
Yeah.
on podcasts talking about births the same as helping people give birth? And the answer is yes. Like it's all
Right.
in just
Yeah.
like keeping her, letting her come to the board meeting and still be
Hmm.
like, but what are we doing for the people? That is always going to be that part of me that like keeps me in check. So I really love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does help. I loved what you were saying earlier, because I think about when you were talking about the decision to like live at home, right? Or when you release the idea that you can't do something, you come back around to, oh yeah, I just don't want to. That type of decision-making process, I think, is admirable, and something that I try to work on too. A reframe for myself that I've been doing lately, which feels along the same lines, is when I feel resentful about some aspect of my life, something, right? Something that's happening, something that's not happening. It's usually things that are not happening that I feel resentful about. I'm always like, okay, so if everything went your way, what would that look like? Okay, I run through that scenario in my head. What would it look like? What would it feel like if everything went the way I wanted it? Okay, so then can we reframe the resentment to just desire? Just to say, hey, I just want this, and it's okay to want it, and not having
Mm.
it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just means I get to keep wanting it. It's about changing it from resentment about what's not happening to trying to enjoy my emotional experience by turning it into desire. I can be annoyed and resentful about what's not happening, or I can be like, oh, but I want this thing so bad, and it's gonna feel like XYZ if this thing happens, or if I get this thing. So I
Mm.
can leave space for it. I can make moves towards it.
So much more empowering and impactful and like
Mhm.
effective. I'm like, let me steer it back to that birth to church founder
Mhm.
pipeline because being effective really is like a guiding thing for me
Mhm.
in that. I was like, how do I show up for these things? The way that I knew how to show up was virtually. I started with holding a monthly, I called it Refill Your Cup, a monthly virtual care circle that was free, where people, typically pregnant folks and moms, would come and we would just move through usually like a somatic practice and then a meditation and then integration and sharing. And I started to become, again, inspired and moved by my marriage and my family and all the dysfunction. The obsessive question has been like, how does change work? How do people change? What is the mechanics of this? And I feel like that's what I've become a student of, is one, through birthing. Then it went into more things of, okay, there's the nervous system. Then I studied hypnosis and mediumship and even Reiki, and really understanding like what are the mechanics of these things. And alongside that is when I was gathering more online with my soft power co-founders, and one of them, Dr. Kiki, hired me to be her spiritual doula, virtual doula for her first baby. And so that started at 3 years ago. Probably this month was our first session. Her baby just turned 2. So we met every month for 18 months to sit and make room for the things that were coming up around her birth. She's a transracial adoptee. And so there's so much loaded in there on top
big
of
feelings.
Yeah. So how do we make room for birthing, if I believe that this is a portal opening and that the baby's trying to come through, and that when we surrender to that process, all these other things can pop up that have been dormant and that are begging to be seen. Like, that's how I visualize it in my head. I have a very like time traveler orientation to existence. But what I see is we open up this portal when we're having a baby, that your baby's coming through. But if you've never been to that portal before, you've got a cue that's, hello, like, I want to be seen. This thing that happened to you when you were 8. I want to be seen. Your grandmother that never was seen before in my years of having 12 children on a farm, and all of these things. And that is what I experience. That's why I think people get so blocked. People can get re traumatized. That's why I say it's actually not the best for people who've had sexual trauma that's unaddressed to be unmedicated and experiencing all those sensations down there if you've never dipped into your subconscious before. Like, your birth is not the time to do that. But that built my framework of like how we dig in and how we can work with these things and make room. And so the more that happened and the more I started to see how effective that was and impactful that was, then I got more and more comfortable loosening on this grip to traditional birth work. And as time went on, I'm collaborating with my 3 co-founders, Dr. Kiki Midori, who's an astrologer who comes from a fine arts background, and Flo, who comes from a master's of public health into the yoga and somatics and movement world. Now she's really exploring how kink fits into all of that. And it's really cool to just see the ways their paths unfold. Kiki came from, like I said, a transracial adoptee who is a choral professor and a student of the voice, and sharing her work, that when we came together was like, oh, the voice and the pelvic floor are 2 cells that split. Like, there's a connection here. And so again, the ancestral algorithm just placed us and dropped us. We're all Saturn in Aquarius. This all incepted during our Saturn return. So we're like 4 queer, gender expansive Asian, mixed Asian girls that got called together. And then whatever you believe about like other lives and timelines and where we see ourselves, it's a lot of ancient priestess visions of linking up here in 2024 and really seeing, okay, like, our souls are expansive as fuck. And so why did we come here to this moment here? Because we also met doing these different like spiritual programs that felt bypassy, that we all came out and we're like, are we supposed to be charging? The messaging of like, charge your worth. And I'm like, I'm worth more than free, but I'm also worth more than $200. But I'm also that advice that falls really flat. And then, oh, don't assume. You don't need to give discounts to your people, because that's not honoring that they're responsible for their money and they know how much they can afford. Like, all these bullshit things that people tell themselves for why they get to exit to the jungle and do all the plant medicine and all of
Mhm.
that. And I'm like, girl, I've been doing shrooms in the park since I was 15. I don't come from a disillusioned, like, I do believe you all know your path. And so maybe your path in this lifetime truly is for you to dissociate from the material world. I don't know. Only you can decide that for yourself. But I'm here for the people who are feeling these things and they're sensing these things. And like when I was pregnant, they just want somebody to say, you're allowed to do that. Yep, you could do that.
Mhm.
Like 99% of people who've hired me just want to hear, yeah, you're allowed to do that. You get to choose whatever you want to do. And you can do that. And here's a group of people who are trying to do that too. And so as it went on, as we're collaborating, I think the vision just started to get deeper and bigger and wider. And we founded an LLC a year ago that was bringing these practices in a business. And again, struggling with us ourselves being anti-capitalist, knowing what the nonprofit industrial complex like is not a solution. Like starting a
Mhm.
church is not inherently a solution. None of these business models are clean or ethically pure.
Right.
And like you got to ditch this purity politics to be effective and get shit done. So as we were coming up with these first like business models of how we're going to fund, really the message, and I don't believe this is for everybody, but the message for us specifically, the four of us, was y'all have the accountability amongst the four of you to responsibly run something like a church. And I want you to trust that you will be provided for. And guess what? We've been provided for. It could still be super delusional. It's an act of faith. I'm not here to say that we started a church to take tax deductible donations because that's the right thing for everybody. You're responsible for sharing those notes, having a board that could vote you off. All of these things are really scary, but you've been given three people to go through it with that you can absolutely trust and that are going to check. My experiences here was like, we know how to approach each other when
Right.
somebody needs to be called in. That's been the building of like resiliency is okay, can you find the courage to propose a plan to people and believe in it enough that you believe it can resource all of you and everybody that's come in to work on this vision. This shit is so scary. Like
Yeah.
leadership is so scary. Like my idea as a solo entrepreneur, only I had to buy into it, and the people hiring me, my clients and customers, had to buy into it. But now I need people to buy into it enough to show up every day and work on this plan that my little brain came up with. It takes a lot, but that
Sure.
has been my calling to leadership. And it's birth work every day. Like I'm caring for birthing of every facet of this business. I'm caring for the grief, the death, the showing up no matter the conditions, which all entrepreneurs know. That's what doula work supported me with. But it's been this act of faith in something unseen. And I think that is part of what makes childbirth really beautiful, is that we're preparing with so much hope and faith for an outcome that we aren't quite sure, but you can't tell yourself that as you're going through it. You cannot go in
Right.
thinking like, what if I don't survive this? Like you made that choice way ahead. People can go through that and do often. But typically you have the baby shower, you put the gifts together and the room together, and you prepare with the faith that this baby's going to come earthside and they're going to be here and you're going to care for them. And that
So
I think
many,
is,
it's so many displays of faith over and over again.
yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. That is how I ended up being a church founder, was like that
Cool.
faith that strengthened through birth, that strengthened through exiting a marriage, and all of these things, like all of these little miracles that I showed myself are like I just am collecting proof of miracles. This is so Jupiter. I'm just like,
Yeah.
I collect miracles so that when I make this decision, people see a Sag rising and they're like, oh, they're random and risky. And I'm like, no, I'm calculated. I know my batting average on
Okay.
jumping for a miracle, and I work on my intuition and I work with my ancestors because I'm not shooting in the dark here.
Yeah, I call
But
it mathematically assisted miracles.
Love that.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah. And so soft power, Church of Soft Power is a mathematically assisted miracle that
Mm,
I just have faith. And the more faith that I grow, the more I trust myself to be in collaboration and trust others. That's the hardest part, is trusting our livelihood with one another,
yeah.
trusting our livelihood into a community to source us, and like these people that we're getting little whispers from spirit to meet with. And that is part of the experiment. Part of the experiment is the behind the scenes of how we're doing it. That's why we started live streaming our Monday morning meetings, because I think the story is more in how we do it, and this
Yeah.
act of faith in each other, and this act of trust building and healing, and like having a safe place to be triggered and come back and mend and grow together. That's the story of soft power, and why we call ourselves a church for the spirits of creativity, care, connection, and change, because it's for everyone to discover their own. It's a safe place. We can't guarantee safety, but with all these practices and studies we've done, we create this environment for people to discover what they believe in. And we're just there to be mirrors. It's, you get to believe in that. Yeah. Like, you believe in what you want to believe in, as long as it upholds life and all these other principles. It went from attending like births in the night to actually probably 24-hour commitment in that. But it's our anti-capitalist solution for how to survive in this world, because our dream is to resource artists and creatives, and we're choosing very, I'll say this here on this podcast, but it's not going to be on our website, that we are very intentional about choosing the language that we're using, because this is a self-trust experiment in how to be effective with our values. We're going to speak to creativity, and we know that is deeply spiritual and mystical. And we're very intentionally not labeling ourselves with all the identities that would get us popular on the internet, because we are looking at the long-term vision of where this country is headed, and churches are safe institutions. They're protected institutions, and they have been places of refuge. And if we're talking about genuinely creating a sanctuary for trans and queer people, which is who our church is made of, we are being extremely mindful of the ways that we are willing to step out with our privileges and our bodies. We're experimenting, but that is what drives the experimenting, is being effective with the world that we are inheriting and the world that we're already in. And if it's going to get more and more dangerous, then we know we're filing in a tax category where we have a higher chance of, I don't know, we can't guarantee anything. I catch myself and I'm like, but I don't really know if that's what's going to happen. We don't really know.
But there is, I've been thinking about this the whole time. There is so much intentionality behind it being a church. And I have a lot of hope for what y'all are doing, because it feels to me like the churches of Pluto and Aquarius, where it's based on, like you said, like a true, I don't know, the intention of a church is supposed to be a safe third space or whatever, but it's also like a nexus of community. It's supposed to be an extension of your mycelial network, essentially. And we're going to need those. We're going to need a lot more of those moving forward as just generally marginalized people. And yeah, it's also just reframing what a church can be. I'm loving so much what you've been talking about in terms of leadership, because when I was in an MLM for 5 years, I read so much about leadership. I read so much fucking John Maxwell books.
Oh
And
my gosh.
I
I
love
had an MLM era, so
yeah. And I actually love John Maxwell. I really have no problem with him. His books are really good. He comes from like a Christian pastor background, but he's written so many books about leadership. And the main takeaways are pretty much always that a good leader is more concerned with serving their people than being served. And a good leader is always modeling like the behaviors. That's really the two main things that stick out to me about leadership when it's being done effectively. It's not the ones who claim I am the leader, therefore XYZ, right? It's the ones who say, hey, I'm doing this. This is what I'm modeling, the way that I am. And if you want to learn from me, or if you want to place me in that position in your life to be somebody to look up to or to be led by, which is also
Mhm.
another huge thing too. In our very neoliberal society, there's a lot of aversion to allowing yourself to be led. Every single one of us is raised to be a leader, right? Everybody's got to be the leader. I'm like, bring back leadership, because it's not that you're a follower and you're a sheeple if you aren't the leader of every gathering. It's that you have the skill of being led. That is a skill in itself, just like leading is. The format of church, I think, is really conducive to allowing both leadership and also being led, and what that can feel like in a way that's not a lot of the gross connotations that can have, especially for people who are like religiously traumatized, you know?
Totally. And we are a lay-led church, a lay-led congregation. So that was also intentional to not have. We were wondering at first, do we need to all go get ordained as ministers and do that? And that was a possibility, and maybe something that still happens. But the lay-led part that really clicked was like, yeah, this is us modeling that we're here to organize and coordinate and to lay foundations and to be protectors of this sanctuary space. But we are not the spiritual leaders. We may share practices because the four of us co founders share identities, but these practices are how our ancestors oriented to the energy of holding a space. Your ancestors have your own ways, and we want you to bring them and explore them too. And leadership really is, to me, my driving force. In fact, my personal business that was born this year that I will be sharing more. I've changed the name on Instagram. That was about it. But it's Mother of Pearl. Shout out to Sam Shar, the vibe caster, who I
Oh,
hired for my rebrand. They
mhm.
channeled this name. Mother of Pearl is the acronym for people emerging as radical leaders. And yeah, I got a little chill again.
Ooh, I know.
She hit me up one day and was like, I got this name that just came through, wondering what you think. I was like, that's freaking epic. And
Okay.
exactly what I'm here to do. And my stacked, my ninth house Leo, Venus,
Mhm.
Mars, and Jupiter are like, yes, you are here to mother, also mother the way that I mother, which is by example, which is through
Mhm.
empowerment and curiosity and play and autonomy and leadership. The reason why soft power really is like the people we serve. We say artists, and we want all people, not because they're people who come from an artist background, but we're like, everyone needs to see themselves as an artist and a leader, because you're leading yourself, you're leading your household, you're leading
Mhm.
your family, whatever that is. And the key thing that I believe we need, or at least the lane we're called to support, is that creativity relationship through the intuition, because that ties back to all the birth stuff. Like, the biggest investment in this country is to disconnect us from our creativity and our creative autonomy so that we cannot imagine and build something beyond. And so I firmly believe that, and that's what soft power like really stands on. Is like you said, we need a different type of leader, we need a different
Mhm.
type of celebrity. Like, people who are
Mhm.
celebrated are those who know how to trust themselves and know how to discern and are willing to use their voice and to accept whatever outcomes and consequences and just make a choice and stand on it. And that is like what we're here to empower. That's why I'm in these calls sometimes. Like, I'm going to cry. And I used to think that was so weak of me. I genuinely, up until this year, was like, oh my God, I hate that I cry when I start speaking about what I care about. Someone had to tell me, do you know how powerful it is, though, to watch you just be willing to cry and not run away when you start crying because how passionate you are about something or how deeply something hits you? Like, people need to see that people are willing to feel that and still show up and pick something and give it a shot, and then be willing to accept when it's time to end and recognize the end of that cycle. And so that's what I really believe. The leaders that we need are people who are tapped in with their creativity, who are tapped into the concept of life being a cycle and not this constant light. That is like the consumer
Mhm.
capitalism that is bled into us, is like
Yeah.
not knowing when to pause and rest, when to let something go, when to release something or someone. We had a fifth co-founder who release themselves. And that was hard for all of us because we're such good friends. And it was really hard to say, I freaking love y'all as my chosen family. And I know this isn't right for me. And that's why it all comes back to that leadership being connection to your creativity and voice. Because I really think only you can decide that. And that's a trust that I try to uplift. And every time I feel like my trust is dwindling in a team situation, I'm like, how can I create an environment for people to feel connected with what's right for them and feel safe enough to tell me that? Because I've had a lot of wounding of people being like, well, you're really intense, like you're hard to say no to. And I'm like, but that's a you thing. That has nothing to do with me. But also learning, people feel like it's a scam when you're like, I just want to hear what you really think. People don't feel safe even with all of that. And that was crushing for me. That was like, oh my God, you don't trust me. And so again, leading by example, stop asking and go work on the little, create the environment that is nourishing for all these things you want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, I was thinking about astrology while you were talking, because in astrology, the fifth house in the chart is represented by children and creativity and art and childbirth, whatever. And I think about the fact that the fifth house follows the fourth house. And the fourth house is your base, where you're creating from, right? It's like the mass of all of the experiences and all the ancestral info that you're born pre-programmed with. All of that comes from the fourth house. And then what follows, like what comes out of that in the fifth house, is that creativity. And I loved when you mentioned being a student of change, because that's the whole process of birthing anything, right? And even childbirth itself, the first time you go through childbirth, it's probably the largest change you've ever gone through, right? It's like your initiation for some people into being a student of change. But really, change is just birth, right? Or death. It's all just part of that same loop. Yeah, it just was giving me a lot of thoughts about the fifth house being opposite from the 11th house, which is where I put like the internet and social media in the 11th house. And these two houses having a relationship with each other. Like you said, sharing what you truly feel with other people is such a purified, a distilled example of that relationship between those two things, of having the vulnerability to tap into yourself, which is like step one of the creative process, but then also to share it. And to me, I'm like, yeah, that's church. I'm like, that sounds like church to me. Or at least a version of church that I would happily go to. Even the versions of church I have been to are the really strictly religious kinds. So what the fuck is the testimony? It's people going up there and crying about how they feel about Jesus, but it's much more vulnerable. And so I love that you're leading by example too. I'm like, yeah, be a crier. I'm trying to be more of a public crier. Like in my day-to-day life, I cry all the time, but I still have that thing about like crying publicly. I'm trying to unlock it. I'm trying to get there.
I believe in you. I really believe in you. I'm the
I really
Cancer
am.
too, Capricorn right now. I'm like, yes,
Right.
cry.
Like I want
Yeah.
to so bad.
I love hearing you speak to what church means or should mean for you, because that really was an inception point probably 3 years ago. As I said to my friend, I just want a place where we can gather and rest and eat together and do hobbies and exchange mutual aid and blah blah blah. And she was like, what you're describing sounds like a church. And I was like, why don't I ever want to go to those? And so she's one who my friend Mitzi reminded me, remember when you had that epiphany that what you want is a church? I remember. And I'm like, yep, exactly. Yep. That's all I want, because that's what I see is like that belonging. That's why for a long time I was so obsessed with like pre-colonial spirituality and judging why people would want to still be Christians or part of a church, even though that was violently forced on us. And now I get it. I'm like, they are one of the only places where people can exchange mutual aid and be provided for and be among people that look like them right now. Because I found a couple radical churches and it just wasn't, the music wasn't hitting. It was very white. And I was like, why don't people want to be here? I'm like, oh, yeah, because belonging matters more than the doctrine itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Just being amongst people, being in connection with others with similar experiences, like that's more powerful than what we're even saying we believe in, and we don't have to say too much. And so that's why I'm more comfortable standing now as a church founder, is just trusting that people will feel it. And I keep receiving affirmation of that. I met somebody who experienced soft power at an event at the First Unitarian of LA, and he was like, this is all really cool and I love this and that, but I feel like you guys are also like undercover radical. And I was like, you don't know how much it means to hear you say that and pick up on that. Because he was like, yeah, I really feel that embodied in what you're saying. And I'm like, that's what I want, is I want people to feel the anti-capitalism. I don't need to say the word anti-capitalism. And that's what I'm practicing, is just embodying these things and trusting that those who get it will get it.
Oh my gosh, I love that. There is something very powerful, and I think about this a lot, very subversive about being the thing without naming the thing and letting people arrive at it on their own. Because when you lead with a label, sometimes it just plants so many ideas in somebody's head that they sometimes can never get past them. It makes a lot of sense. And it would be a very different if you guys were leading with like radical anti-capitalist church. Like, I think soft power, just even in the wording, because I believe a lot in names are very powerful. So even just the wording of soft power invites you in, but it feels like it's inviting you in to something instead of standing and screaming about what it is.
Yeah. And that is the reminder in the name for us, because we're all raging feminists at the end of the day. And there's also something very sacred about the being willing to say all those things with your chest. And I think I'm only comfortable softening now. I don't have to say it because I've probably screamed it a million times, like all these things I believe in. And soft power for me is that reminder to bring it back to the power. It's creative power. And seeing that name is what reels me in sometimes, because I'm not always feeling soft, and also discerning when needs somebody to rage and someone to bring that sword and torch or whatever, and just be like, no. Soft power is a spell over ourselves to remind us, hey, bring it back to what's impactful and effective again. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Okay. So people can join Soft Power in our virtual sanctuary on our website with softpower.org. All of our events are held in the same Zoom room because we really take the frequency seriously and cultivating that frequency. So drop in or RSVP, or you can watch us on our YouTube channel at With Soft Power every Monday morning, where we stream our Moon Day grounding meetings, and you can get a little behind the scenes of our day-to-day as church founders. Other than that, we have our free membership called Village in the Sky, and that's just for people to stay connected. Everything that we offer right now is free and open to the public, but the Village in the Sky is a place to really connect and build, and that's what we're looking forward to in 2025, is a lot more organizing opportunities and co-creative opportunities in there.
I love that. I've
Thank
been
you for this
online since I was
combo.
like 8 years old. So
Dude, I love it. I'm like, this is what I dreamt of as a kid, and I just accepted it. I'm like, yeah, I'm an Aquarius moon, of course. Even Midori, who's she's just always, every time I just know you're in your feels, and I know that you're going through the most like intense shit, and then I see you on threads just like responding like this. That's how I process, and that is my life. Is I'm gonna reach to the internet for random connection. I'm gonna be on Reddit to heal. Okay,
Absolutely.
that's my workshop coming next year. My healer is Reddit.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I feel that. Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm very excited to share your church and also just you with the world. All right, friends, that's a wrap for this week's conversation. If you're anything like me, you'll be digesting the threads of this conversation, like how creative power can be a tool of resistance, how we can navigate change without losing sight of ourselves, how embracing uncertainty leads to profound transformations. There's a lot of cud to chew on here. To our listener who shared that incredible question, thank you again. Your words, though I did not read them during our conversation, were directly woven through this entire exchange. And so I hope that was made obvious. Change is never linear or simple, but that doesn't make it any less worthwhile. And we can all be students of change whenever we decide to. So remember that whatever direction you choose, you're allowed to honor your craft within that and within whatever restrictions will be present in your new life. And you're still allowed to honor your evolving desires throughout that process. They can coexist, even if it feels complex or wrong, or if it goes against anything that you've been taught to want or taught to believe is desirable. And like I said, there's a new moon in Capricorn that's rounding out 2024 for us, and Capricorn energy being all about structure and commitment in the long game makes this a perfect time to reflect on what's worth carrying forward and what needs to be left behind as we move into a new calendar year. So let's not romanticize this. Capricorn and Saturn ask us for honesty and reality, not perfection, not pretty presentation. So as you set your intentions or release whatever you're releasing, whatever you're doing for this new moon, keep it grounded. Think of it as building a foundation for 2025, brick by brick, instead of some kind of grand sweeping overhaul. And speaking of strong foundations, I do want to highlight 2 amazing resources which Siobhan uplifted during our conversation. The first is Cornerstone Doula Trainings in San Francisco, an organization redefining what care and support can look like. Siobhan mentioned their work is really a testament to the power of community and education. And of course, Sam Shar, the vibecaster, who Siobhan also mentioned, whose work I am a fan of. Their cosmic and practical grounding is really a gift to anyone who's lucky enough to work with them. And if you haven't checked out her offerings yet, now would be the time. Very much recommend Sam's work. And thank you, listener, as always, for being here, for listening, for allowing these conversations to stretch your heart and your mind. Thank you for being a part of my 2024 and this incredible project that I was able to birth because I was able to create space for it in my life when it was ready to be born. I'm so touched that anybody takes the time to listen to these conversations. They mean the world to me. It means the world to me that you're here. Looking forward to 2025. I've already got some amazing guests lined up for the next few episodes, so I can't wait to bring those to you. And yeah, keep exploring, keep evolving, keep honoring your creativity, keep questioning why you want the things you want. And until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other.